This is your government video on grants. A grant is a gift of money that is granted from the federal government to either a state or local government. In a previous video, we talked about federal mandates. A federal mandate is when the federal government requires that state or local governments do something. And sometimes those mandates come with money. That would be a grant. Sometimes grants are mandated, and sometimes they are just there to incentivize state or local governments to do what the federal government wants it to do. So there are many purposes of grants, but one of them is to supply state and local governments with revenue, which is money for them to impose some type of law. So if the federal government really wants to impose a law everywhere in the country, they can either pass a federal mandate that would really upset some states, but they could do it, or they can offer grant money, and they can use this as a carrot to try to draw states or incentivize them to do what the federal government wants without actually having to mandate it. If so, they typically take the grant money offered by the federal government and then use it to implement this particular law. So the states are technically taking the money and they have the option of saying no. A lot of times the federal government uses grants to establish a minimum national standard. We, in a previous video, talked about Clean Air and Clean Water Acts. Both of these establish a minimum amount of pollution that we will allow all across the United States in our water and in our air. Again, in order to ensure that we are enforcing these, the federal government can grant money to state governments and help them pay for people to go out and make sure that our streams are safe, that our drinking water is safe, and that places that pollute the air are abiding by certain federal government requirements. Grants also equalize resources. So in the example when we talked about how the tragedy of the commons or racing to the bottom happens, if states have various regulations on something like clean air and clean water, then suddenly we can get a lot of racing to the bottom and a lot of pollution and negative side effects in one area and positive side effects in the other. So a grant would mandate the same law across the country, but instead of requiring it through a mandate, they're granting states a bunch of extra money if they choose to do this. And because states generally have less tax dollars than the federal government, a lot of times they say yes to this money. Grants are also used by the federal government to help attack national problems and minimize the growth of federal government agencies. There's a lot of people who believe our federal government is way too large, we have way too many employees, and it takes too many tax dollars to supply that federal government. So if proponents of a smaller federal government win office seats in the executive branch or in Congress, they are far more likely to reduce the size of the federal government and therefore try to transfer some of that power and enforcement to state governments. How do they do this? They do this with grant money. At the beginning, the idea is that the federal government will just pay the state government to do it, and then over time they will lessen that money and states can start taxing in order to do it on their own. But if you believe something is a national problem, let's say you want to secure all the borders of the country. Well, that's a federal government issue. So how do you do that when you have to go into every state that borders with either an ocean or a foreign country? Well, now you've got to kind of partner up with the state that is a border state. And one of the ways you can do that is through grants of money to help the state figure out that particular issue.